Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Glad you're here. Happy Tuesday. Coming up, we're going to talk to Christopher Rufo from the City Journal. He's one of our go-to experts on homelessness. Frequently, we're thinking about what's going on personally, my family, then our state, then the country, and then I think, geez, what about homeless people? And I think, oh man, what about India and Africa and the third world? And I think that just kind of start to spiral. So Christopher Rufo, we're going to talk to him about the state of homeless people and their situation with COVID, because they're people too, first of all, and they go to the same hospitals that everyone else goes to. If it just rips through, Skid Row in LA. So talk about that coming up in just a few minutes. Also, we didn't do it yesterday, but I promised today we're going to talk about Captain Crozier and the whole drama there with the Navy. We actually have another update from yesterday, so I'm glad we actually were able to wait today. Right now, though, I want to talk about vaccines. So we had the Army colonel on yesterday, retired colonel, and he kind of has this posture that we need to focus less on the vaccine as our saving grace, because it's going to take a very long time, if ever, to get one. And it's not entirely necessary. As we talked about yesterday, if we get some really good treatments first, then we can sort of manage this disease over time, and we don't necessarily need a vaccine. Okay, so that being said, I want to talk about vaccines. So first, this is Dario Farazano of the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization, and Maria Bottazzi. I don't know why I did both. Associate Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. Both of these people have worked on SARS and MERS and other coronaviruses and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so let's do bad news. Bad news first, but just reality first. So this is an interview that they both did in Self magazine of all places. And the question was, how close are we to a vaccine? And one of these doctors said, well, we don't have one. There are no approved coronavirus vaccines that are used in humans. All right, so that means not only do we lack a vaccine for the new coronavirus, COVID, the Wuhan flu, but we got nothing for MERS, we got nothing for SARS, we have no vaccines. This might be hard to believe, given how many experts have devoted countless hours to trying to develop these vaccines, but infectious diseases are wily beasts, and the process of creating vaccines can be lengthy and challenging, even under the best of circumstances. As Bottazzi said, vaccines are not easy to develop. So let's talk about that process. There are currently 26 different potential vaccines in development at different stages around the country. Most are in the very, very earliest of stages. A few are in animal testing, which is quite a far step from human testing, which we'll get to in a second. There's one vaccine that's currently being tested on humans and animals at the same time. It's in Seattle. They skipped over the animals. So usually you find out what you need, and then you do animals for 3 to 6 months, and then you do humans. They did animals and humans at the exact same time, which is against all protocol. It's not illegal, but it's not how things are normally done. It's super risky. But that's the only one being tested on humans right now. It takes about 15 to 20 years to make a vaccine. And we're going to get in a little bit here to this, because you've heard 12 to 18 months. Someone just made that up. Someone just made up 12 to 18 months, and we're all just parroting it, repeating it, without even any critical analysis to it whatsoever. Usually it takes 15 to 20 years to go through this normal process. If it works at all, right? Like there's no AIDS vaccine. This is actually someone who's one of the heads of the AIDS vaccine initiative. When you hear predictions about it taking at best a year or a year and a half to have a vaccine available, there's no way to come close to those timelines unless we take new approaches. And a new approach might be something like skip over animal testing completely, which I get, right? But that is super risky. There's a reason why we have a process. So the current process is you find out a vaccine that we think makes sense, and there's a whole science to that, which we'll skip over for now. But you do it on animals. That takes about 3 to 6 months at the earliest. Then you do humans, and there's phase 1. You do about 20 to 100 people. So the one that they're doing right now, they have 55 healthy adults aged 18 to 55. They give them the vaccine, and then they watch them for a year, and they see if there's any major side effects over the course of a year. If that seems safe, then they do phase 2, and there's a couple hundred people they give it to, and then there's phase 3 where they give it to a couple thousand people, and then they have the FDA approval process, which is the whole thing, and then they have phase 4 where they do the whole thing again, and that's why this whole thing takes many, many, many years. This 12 to 18 month thing, just made up. Another quote, it'll take weeks just to vaccinate a large portion of the population. People may need more than one dose of the vaccine, and demand for the vaccine will likely far outstrip availability at first if we need to wait for new vaccine production facilities. So that's why Bill Gates said in an op-ed a couple days ago that we need to build multiple production facilities now for when this day comes, when we actually have one that we think works. Otherwise, we're gonna have to wait a whole year or whatever it is before we can even start really ramping up production of it. So that was a couple days ago. And then just yesterday or 2 days ago, Bill Gates came out and said, all right, fine, I'm gonna invest billions of dollars to build 7 factories, and maybe we'll use 1 or 2 of them. Isn't that amazing? Think about that investment. That's a ridiculous investment to make. Or none of them. That's the other thing, that we may use none of those. But none of those vaccines may work at all. But it'll save us many, many months if we start ramping up on that now. Incredible from Bill Gates right there. The doctor there talked about multiple doses. Because this is a new virus, you're probably gonna need 2 doses. So even let's say we can make 1 billion doses of this stuff, right? Let's say you get the very first vaccine, like manna from heaven, God drops a vaccine on your doorstep today. So you take it. Well, that angel from heaven is gonna have to come back in about 4 weeks and give you another dose. And then you'll have to wait another 2 weeks before that all even starts to work. So even if we got it today, which obviously you're not, that would take about 6 weeks before it finally goes into effect. Vaccines take a very long time, and we can't wait for that entire time before we go back to life. It's a possibility. So again, can we go back to somewhat normal life with just treatments? That needs to be the goal. Maybe we go back to some sort of normal life with treatments, but as Bill Gates said, there's no way you can pack 100,000 people inside of a college football game until there is that vaccine. So something to think about. That's the bad news. And I think it's good to have that perspective and get our minds straight for timeline-wise. Let me end with some potential good news. This is Peter Kolsinski. He's a biotechnology investor and scientist. So I'm just gonna give the very short, streamlined Spark Notes version of the science of this, but I think it can help visualize this. So our cells are made up of DNA. A virus is made up of what's called RNA. So RNA is only a single strand. DNA is that double helix. This RNA inside of a virus, it can mutate over time. So the virus gets inside of a cell, it hijacks the cell, it tells the cell to make more of the virus. Because this is what's pretty wild about viruses. So if you put a bacteria in a petri dish, the bacteria will make more bacteria. If you put a virus in a petri dish, it won't do anything. It can't do anything. It needs cells in order to make more of the virus. So a virus takes over one of your cells, it says, hey, make more of me, and it starts making more cells. In this process of making more virus, it might make slight changes to the RNA sequence, which can mutate it. One of these days, we'll get to the story about the Spanish flu mutated by the time the second wave hit, which is why the second wave was so much more deadly. A virus could mutate to be less deadly. It could mutate to be more deadly. The Spanish flu mutated to be more deadly, which is why younger people were killed more in the second wave of the Spanish flu. We'll do that another day. So the very short of this, the COVID genome is one long strand of genetic code. The flu virus has 8 segments to it. So think of COVID as 1 page of data, and think of the flu as 8 pages. A little more complicated. So every time a virus infects a cell, and the cell makes more of it, there's a chance that some of those pages swap around, and some of the data on those pages flips around and changes things a little bit. Now, the flu has 8 pages, so it's much more likely that that's going to change over time. COVID, the point is, COVID may not mutate as much over time. May not mutate as much, which is good news if we're trying to make a vaccine. So the flu vaccine, someone finds a new strain somewhere around the world, somewhere in Asia or something. So they call up the vaccine manufacturers and they say, hey, here's this new strain of the flu. Our vaccine manufacturers start making it as soon as possible to try and get the vaccine out before that new flu strain makes it to America. It takes 6 months to make enough of that vaccine. 6 months, so it's 70 years of doing this. and with like maximum infrastructure, all these scientists, the whole process is like as efficient as possible. It still takes 6 months to make a flu vaccine. The problem is the flu mutates pretty quickly. As we talked about, the 8 pages of genetic data. So the flu mutates pretty fast. So sometimes it'll completely change by the time it gets to America, and that's when the vaccine doesn't work, and that's when we have a really bad flu year. That's why. But as this smart scientist says, think about it this way. If flu evolves with the speed of a growing vine, then coronavirus is like a cactus. If you look very closely, a cactus can appear to be changing from day to day, but it's nothing like a vine. So the good news, so again, bad news, it takes a very long time to make a vaccine that works and that we're sure doesn't kill people, right? Talk about cure being worse than the disease. You don't want to give a vaccine to people that gives everyone a stroke in a year, right? So that's a very difficult process. But the good news is, if we do end up making a vaccine, the chances are that the virus will mutate and the vaccine won't work anymore are very slim for COVID, we think. Could you imagine if we did that, right? Imagine if we went through this whole process. Bill Gates spent billions of dollars making all these factories. We make 1 billion doses, and then by the time the vaccine's mass produced, the virus has changed completely and it doesn't work anymore. Could you imagine? And we'd have to go through that entire process all over again. Good news is that seems unlikely. Hopefully this virus doesn't change much over time. I think that's good news. Is that good news? I don't know. I think I agree with our Army colonel that we talked to yesterday. We can't put all of our eggs in the vaccine basket. It's going to take way too long, and that can't be our way out. Coming up next, I want to talk about Colonel Crozier. I think I'm in the not as popular position on this whole situation. If you've missed this story, we're going to start from the beginning. We'll run through it. Coming up next, True Story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. Really excited to talk to Christopher Rufo. He's from the Discovery Institute and also City Journal. And gosh, we've talked many times about homelessness with him. And I think a lot about this. I've been thinking a lot about it the last few weeks, thinking about lower income parts of our country, homeless encampments. And then I started thinking about like Africa and India. And I don't think people are talking enough about these places. And how it's going to affect people in these places. So I'm excited to talk to Chris Rufo. Chris, how are you, brother?
Really well. Thanks for having me.
I've also thought a lot about, last time we talked, you talked about Italy and how Italy has a perhaps a more close-knit familial culture, and how maybe that could help them fare better throughout COVID than perhaps America is. I don't remember if we talked about that before this whole COVID thing hit. I think we did. I think we were talking about mental health, actually. And we were talking about addicts, and you used that as an example. So and maybe I just made up the COVID part, but is that true? Do you think Italy maybe is handling this better because of some different cultural differences than America is?
Well, this is kind of the irony is last time we talked was before COVID, and we were talking about how Italy does a better job at treating and kind of containing addiction and mental illness. But in this COVID scenario, Italy's strengths in that is actually their weakness in preventing the transmission of the virus. In Italy, you have a lot of people who, kind of millennials who are living with parents and grandparents. You have a really high rate of interconnectivity between generations. And what that's meant in Italy is that the transmission of the virus really accelerated there faster than anywhere else in the Western world, and they're struggling to keep up. I've talked to cousins of mine that have been in lockdown for more than a month. They're scared because the numbers and the death toll are very high, and you add into the mix a universal healthcare system, a publicly financed healthcare system that already had shortages of necessary medical supplies and necessary capacity for medical procedures. When you put those two things together, high rates of transmission between generations, and an already kind of quasi-rationed medical system, you get what you have now, which is more than 15,000 dead in a very small country.
I think as people try to explain why different countries have different spread rates and whatever, I think there's this tendency to kind of go towards medical reasons, or maybe something like, well, these people wear masks and they don't. And I look at them like, maybe, like, yes, and different cultural differences, like you just brought up there. In America, we have a lot more nursing homes and assisted living facilities, which I don't think is ideal, but in this case, it maybe helped quarantine older folks. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's kind of a double-edged sword, because although there's less kind of intergenerational contact in the United States, people, when they hit 18, they try to move out of their parents' house. That's kind of the common cultural pattern. That's probably good. You have folks who are older or retired, 65 plus, or that are really already segregated culturally from younger folks in the population. At the same time, you had the real beginning of this outbreak was at a nursing home in just outside of Seattle, Washington. So it protects you when the virus is not there, but when the virus hits, any kind of enclosed space, whether it's a cruise ship, it's a nursing home, it's a dormitory, it's even a church choir practice, you can have really high rates of spread. So it's a double-edged sword, but I think your bigger point is exactly right. People are searching for scientific solutions and really ignoring some of those cultural attributes that can either be a big positive or a big negative in tamping down the disease.
Interesting. Okay, very good. Let's talk about why I really want to talk to you, although now there's a million other things we need to talk about. But homelessness, right? So what, and I don't hear anyone really talking about it, and what the heck is going to happen when COVID just rips through Skid Row? Should that be a concern or what?
It is. It's a huge concern, and public health officials in California have predicted that up to 66,000 people on the streets could become infected with COVID-19 virus. I think that's probably high, given how transmission is slowing, but it's still a huge problem for a couple reasons. One is because if you are homeless, you're on the streets, you're in tent encampments with other people, or you're in a shelter, there's really close contact. So it's creating a situation for becoming a vector of transmission. At the same time, people experiencing homelessness have very high rates of pre-existing medical conditions, psychiatric conditions, and addiction, which makes them more likely to get very sick and less likely to be responsive to treatment. So you're seeing cities across the West Coast really scrambling to figure out what they're doing with this. And in the context that for the last 10 years, they've totally dropped the ball. They've let this problem get out of control. They've let it become really already a public health emergency. And you're seeing a response from leaders that, frankly, hasn't been very effective. The city of San Francisco is trying to rent out thousands of hotel rooms and put people from the streets into the hotel rooms. But they're coming up with this across this big problem that it's very hard to get someone who is addicted and mentally ill and living on the streets into a safe environment. Just that is very difficult. So they're really trying to shuffle and reroute. And what's happened in all of these cities is that you've had police and health service really kind of retreat into the background, and you've had these homeless encampments become the focal point for street life. And it's absolutely possible that this could be turn out to be a disaster.
Yeah, it's as you're talking, and you're 100% right, I haven't heard anyone talk about it. I haven't heard any stories about testing homeless people, right? Because no one's been aware of it. So when are we even going to really know if or how much COVID has ripped through different homeless communities? Will we ever?
You know, we're just starting to get the first trickle of information. They just diagnosed the first case in Los Angeles recently. A homeless shelter worker is in the ICU. He contracted it while on the job on Skid Row. We had the first case in Seattle reported. I think there were about 200 cases in Boston among the homeless population. So the numbers are coming out slowly, and I think it's absolutely possible that the real numbers are a bit higher. But we're really just starting to get this. And I don't know the exact kind of decision making on how they're distributing tests, but certainly people who are the most vulnerable, people who have the least kind of capacity to take care of their own health are also probably the least likely to get tested. And
Yeah.
What I'm hearing from inside homeless shelters is that they're trying to quarantine people who have symptoms, but it's very messy, and I think it's a potential tinderbox for infection if we don't make immediate emergency changes.
Infection and then reinfection back out to the rest of the population, if you will. It's tough to have this conversation, and I hope we all have grace with everyone, because it tends to seem like I'm talking about homeless people like they're different, not like a different race of people or something, right? It's like homeless people and then regular people. And sort of my next question could be construed that way, and obviously that's not my intent. But a couple weeks ago, we talked about Italy's rationed care document, and then like 2 weeks ago, we talked about the document put out by Ezekiel Emanuel about rationing care and how and what the standards are and whatever. And we went over it, and I threw in this last element of, so one of the points was that Ezekiel Emanuel and this whole team, New England Journal, said you can take someone off of a ventilator and you won't be charged with murder. Like, it's the ethical thing to do if there's an 80-year-old on a ventilator and a 60-year-old comes in and needs it, right? So then I was thinking, okay, well, what about if you're a scenario where there's a 70-year-old, my mom's 71, a 71-year-old on a ventilator, and a homeless drug addict comes in who's 50 and been living on the streets for 20 years, and he gets the ventilator. That's, I don't know why that's different, really, but it is. So I'm putting you in a really difficult difficult position to sort of talk through that. But homeless people go to the same hospitals as regular people. So how do you think through that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I would say that from what I know about the protocol is that you take in a really wide range of considerations. So you take in not only age, but you also take the ability to make a full recovery. You take in where they are in the progression of the disease. So I would really defer that. I'm going to punt and defer that to medical expertise. But it is scary. And I think, fortunately, in the United States, and in California and Oregon and Washington, where we are, the West Coast states, we've actually done a pretty good job at increasing our capacity and reducing the rate of transmission. So I think the best case scenario is if we don't have to make any of these decisions. And one thing that people forget is that a lot of times the progressive left always says that the European health system is so much better. But if you look at the number of beds per capita, the number of ventilators per capita, and the capacity of the healthcare system per capita, it's an order of magnitude smaller than what we have in the United States. Obviously, healthcare is a dysfunctional sector here as well, and could do with a lot of increase in efficiency and productivity and price transparency. But fortunately, we don't have to make any of those rationing care decisions yet, and hopefully it remains this way throughout the epidemic.
This is maybe too early for this question, but have you given any thought to what cultural changes, lifestyle changes you think we could see in America, or maybe you'd like to see? Or do you think we'll just go right back to the way things were whenever this whole thing's over and nothing changes?
A bit of both. So I think it's more likely than not that we'll go back to the way things were. There's kind of a regression to the mean or a return to the status quo ante that is really part of human nature. But if there's one cultural change that I'd like to see, it's really this. What I think the coronavirus epidemic has revealed is that every sector of American society is really kind of pushing it to the margins and really dangerously over-leveraged. So if you look at American households, something like 40% of American households would have trouble coming up with a $400 emergency fund. If you look at our big companies, our airlines and our banks and other big kind of corporate entities, after 2 weeks of the coronavirus, they already needed a bailout. They couldn't really weather 2 weeks of business disruption. And then if you look at the federal government, I mean, we're printing trillions of dollars in cash like it's nothing. And I think all of those three things show there's something inherent in our culture that we're overspending, that we're over indebting ourselves, we're over leveraging ourselves. And what I'd like to see is for leadership at every level to call for all American households, corporations, and government to shore up their balance sheets, to start reviving those American virtues of thrift, of savings, of planning for the future, thinking long term, and anticipating disasters. And a farmer friend told me earlier this week, he said, this is where farmers, we know how to handle this. We can never count on a good crop. You can never count on a good price at market. So we always try to have some reserves and some cash to keep us through. I think that's wise advice for everyone in the entire country.
That's so brilliant. 30 seconds. On that point, I'm seeing, we've seen these aerial pictures in Pittsburgh and then in Florida today of like a line of cars a mile long at the food bank. And I look at that, I'm like, geez, like, this hasn't been going on that long. Like, and I'm like, are we out of food? And it's like, well, no, probably these people are out of money, to your point that people don't have, enough in savings to even get us through this long. But then I'm like, oh, this is my privilege talking because I have it so good here and I could quarantine forever in our house and our nice grocery store down the street and everything. What do I need to keep in mind about lower income communities and different parts of our country, whether it's rural or urban, as you've done so much research on, so that I can be less prideful and more empathetic about that?
Yeah, well, I think what we're going to see in those pictures of the kind of drive-in lines to the food banks show, this is something that we haven't seen in our lifetimes. This is something that is very different than people who are kind of chronically born into poverty, remain in poverty, transmit poverty intergenerationally. There's definitely a part of society, really an entire class, that is been stuck in that poverty situation for a long time. But what you're seeing now is that people who are in the kind of working class being instantly submerged into poverty. We might have 15 or 20 million people become unemployed in the next few weeks, in the total numbers as far as coronavirus. And this is something that's unprecedented. We haven't seen anything like it since the Great Depression. And this is I would say, a different population than the chronically poor. This is a population that has been really thrust into economic poverty because the country has shut down. And I think the best solution, obviously, provide food, provide essentials in the meantime, provide emergency cash assistance to people. Those are all good moves. But in the medium term, we have to get businesses back open. We have to get these folks back to work because, ultimately, everyone wants to be self-sufficient and independent, and that's the direction we need to go.
Beautiful. Real Chris Rufo from the Discovery Institute and also City Journal. Awesome to talk to you again, Chris. Really appreciate you. Thanks, brother. Good stuff. Coming up next, we'll talk about the Captain Crozier story with the latest update, which is changing every couple hours here. It's coming up next. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, have you been following the Captain Crozier story? There's so much going on with everything nonstop. Maybe you've missed it or you've come in on the middle of it or whatever. So I want to start from the beginning. We'll catch everyone up and then we'll get to what maybe is the conclusion, although probably not. I think I'm in the minority on this story as well, too, but we'll get to that in a second. So here's the deal. Teddy Roosevelt, aircraft carrier, stationed here in San Diego. About 4,000 sailors on it, a little over. Last we heard, there's 137 sailors who have COVID. It's in Guam right now. So last week, the Captain Crozier, wrote a letter to his superiors saying he wants his entire crew to be quarantined. He said it's COVID spreading, it's bad, and we're putting our sailors at risk. So he sent this email to 20 people, which is important, we'll get to that later, and it was leaked to the San Francisco Chronicle, which of course they published. It's a 4-page letter. So let's quote a little bit of it here, just so you get an idea of what he wrote. This will require a political solution, but it's the right thing to do. We are not at war. We'll get to that in a minute. Sailors do not need to die. If we do not act now, we are failing to properly take care of our most trusted asset, our sailors. Due to warship's inherent limitations on space, we are not doing this, the social distancing. The spread of the disease is ongoing, accelerating. He wanted everyone to be in quarantine rooms in Guam as soon as possible. Removing the majority of personnel from a deployed U.S. nuclear aircraft carrier and isolating them for 2 weeks may seem like an extraordinary measure, but this is a necessary risk. Keeping over 4,000 young men and women on board the TR, Teddy Roosevelt, is an unnecessary risk and breaks faith with those sailors entrusted to our care. Okay, so he sent that last week. I think the next day he got fired. Relieved of duty is the official term. So I think the initial knee-jerk reaction from conservatives is like the patriotic one. and that is to support our military. And you're thinking, well, hold on, this is all the military, right? But I think if it's a tie, right? So if it's a military versus military, I think people are going to go with the lower rank as opposed to like the paper pushers in DC, right? So I think that's the knee-jerk stance of most conservatives, is to be on Captain Crozier's side. And I get it. He was trying to protect his sailors, whole thing. And I brought this up with my wife a couple days ago. And I was on Captain Crozier's side. I was like, can you believe that they fired the guy? They fired him right there because he was just and she goes, no. So you got to fire him. And I said, no, wife, you don't get it. Like, she was really, and she said, no, you can't do that. She said, and I tried to pose this like eloquent argument or whatever, and she just shot it down. She cut me off. But she's like, no, you can't do that. She wouldn't even hear my arguments anymore. And the more I thought about it, I was like, you might be right, actually. Now, we still don't know the full story. There's like two elements of this that are still really important. We don't know what steps the Navy was taking or was in the process of taking to help the people on the ship. And we don't know if Captain Crozier tried to go through the proper channels first before he sent this email out to 30 people, knowing it was going to be leaked. Those are two very important pieces of data that we don't know at this time. So he was fired a couple days ago. The Secretary of the Navy said this. He said he did not safeguard that information and keep it from being sent anywhere. That was a completely unnecessary thing to do in the midst of a crisis. Granted, we don't train for this, but we expect more from our commanding officers than they trained for. We expect them to exercise good judgment that does not put their crews in jeopardy. I lost confidence in his ability to lead the warship as it continues to fight against this virus, get the crew healthy so that it can continue to meet its national security requirements. That's why he fired him. So now that I'm on the secretary's side, right? You can't tell the world, China mostly, that our aircraft carrier is out of commission and the entire crew's sick and weak. Can't do that. And again, we don't know if he tried to go up the chain of command and was ignored. If that's the case, then he did the right thing. If he skipped the chain of command, then no, you can't do that. Or if you do it, then you're going to get fired. And that's just what you do. Now, let me take a break here. And we'll come back to this. One of the most amazing things about this whole COVID thing in general, but even this story, is there's nothing new under the sun. Remember this was weeks ago, we talked about the Antonine Plague of 165. Marcus Aurelius was the emperor, and he wrote in his diary at the time. So he wrote this to himself. He said, to bear in mind, so he said, you, Marcus, bear in mind constantly that all of this has happened before and will happen again. The same plot from beginning to end, the identical staging. And then he listed all these people who have gone through very similar things in his past. Again, he wrote this in 165. And then he ends, he said, all just the same, only the people different. And it's the same thing here too. Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, again, the ship is named the Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt himself, by the way, probably one of the most baller people ever in American history. Every book about Teddy Roosevelt is awesome. There's one called The River of Doubt, which is just part of this one little tiny portion of his life after he lost his second presidential election. Like, crazy, ridiculous story. So have you ever read a Teddy Roosevelt story? If you're really looking for one, The River of Doubt is an awesome one. Anyway, the guy's the man. So he's in the Spanish-American War. It's 1898. I think we have a picture of him at that time. So Colonel Roosevelt, there he is. Colonel Roosevelt was stationed in Cuba with the Rough Riders, right? And baller name too. And almost all of the 4,270 men, which is very similar to the crew of the Teddy Roosevelt, almost all of them got wrecked with yellow fever and malaria. And Roosevelt knew that if they all stayed in Cuba, then they were all gonna die. So he met with the people above him, just above him, who were also on the island, and they all agreed, and it fell on Roosevelt to write a letter to the senior leadership in DC asking them all to leave Cuba. And it fell on him because he was the only non-general among the senior officer group, so therefore he had the less to lose when his butt got fired, because someone was going to get fired, just like this. And Captain Crozier had to have known this too. He had to have known he was going to get fired for what he did. And Teddy Roosevelt thought he was going to get fired for what he was going to do as well. So he wrote this letter. It's called the Round Robin letter. So just a couple quotes. So he wrote there, and this is Teddy Roosevelt to DC. The whole command is so weakened and shattered as to be ripe for dying like rotten sheep. If we are kept here, it will in all human possibility mean an appalling disaster. If there were any object and any reason for keeping us here, we would face yellow fever with as much indifference as we faced bullets. So he's like, listen, if we have to stay and fight, we'll die from bullets, but even before that, we're gonna die from this yellow fever and malaria. So what's the point? We gotta get out of here. So Roosevelt sent the letter to the Army headquarters in DC, and gosh golly, wouldn't you know it, just so happened, the wires crossed and it just got sent to a reporter at the Associated Press. What had happened, just random. What a mistake. And of course, he published it the very same day. So President McKinley was furious, as was the Major General. Here's the Major General. He said it would be impossible to exaggerate the mischievous and wicked effects of the round robin. It afflicted the country with a plague of anguish and apprehension, which is very similar to something that the Secretary of the Navy said. We'll get to that in just a second. So that being true, it worked. The men were picked up from Cuba and they were sent to Long Island. And Captain Crozier's letter worked too, maybe, right? His sailors were taken off the ship and quarantined. But again, I don't know what the steps were. Maybe the Navy was going to do that anyway, or they were in the process of doing that. I don't know. But I think it goes in history, like what Roosevelt did, cutting through the red tape by going to the media, saved thousands of lives. And Crozier feels that his actions did the same. And it's pretty obvious that at least as of last week, his men felt that same way too. I'm sure you've seen this video by now, but here's just one angle. A nice moment for him. So let me wrap this up, and then I want to come back and we'll give the follow-up here. It is possible that both are right? And we need to, in this time of nuance of the world, we need to be comfortable with that. It's possible that both are right. It's possible that he needed to write a letter to the media, because that's really what that was. He needed to write a letter to the media and go around the chain of command in order to keep his men safe, and the Navy had to fire him for doing that. Right? It's possible that both could be it. And the captain did the right thing and fell on his sword for it. And he can leave his command feeling that he did the right thing. And although he had to leave earlier than he planned, that's not a bad way to go, really. With your head held high and your crew cheering you on. Let me take a break here. I want to come back with what the Secretary of the Navy, how he's responded. By the way, should note, Captain Crozier was diagnosed with COVID this weekend. We'll give you the latest to this story next. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. All right, I want to pick up the story where we left off. So Captain Crozier, the captain of the Teddy Roosevelt, we don't have to go through the whole thing again, but the latest is he was relieved of duty, and then he got COVID. All right, so we found out this weekend that he got COVID. Now, the Secretary of the Navy went to Guam and talked to all the guys on the ship. Okay. Now, I don't exactly know how this went down. When I first read the transcript, we have audio of it, which we'll get to in a second. I didn't think we were ever going to have audio, but somehow there's audio of it. I wasn't sure his tone. So you got to be careful whenever you read something, right? I wasn't sure what his tone was. I wasn't sure, obviously, what the mood was. Like, what was the vibe of the room? Did he give it in a room? Was would that be weird, right? Because the whole thing was about quarantining people. So was everyone in the same room when he did this? Were they booing him? Were they cheering him? Were they understanding him? Were they silent? Like, I had no idea what the tension was. I didn't know what his tone was, what the people's reactions were. So all these unknowns, and as I was reading, I was just sort of making it up in my head. But we got audio now. So I guess it was over some sort of speaker system to everybody. So we'll play a little of the audio here, but this is part of what he said.
And it's now become a big controversy in Washington, D.C. and across the country about a martyr CO who wasn't getting the help he needed and therefore had to go through the chain of command, a chain of command which includes the media. And I'm going to tell you something, all of you. There is never a situation where you should consider the media a part of your chain of command. You can jump the chain of command if you want and take the consequences. You can disobey the chain of command and take the consequences. But there is no situation where you go to the media, because the media has an agenda. And the agenda that they have depends on which side of the political aisle they sit. And I'm sorry that's the way the country is now, but it's the truth. And so they use it to divide us. They use it to embarrass the Navy. They use it to embarrass you. While you're out here dealing with something that this country hasn't had to deal with in over 100 years. And the world hasn't ever dealt with anything like this on this scale.
So that's 100% true, isn't it? About the media? I got some more comments about him in a second, but let's talk about the media for a second. The media, when he went to the media thinking that would help him or whatever, what did the media do with it? They spun it to attack the Navy. The media, the mainstream media is never going to be on the side of the American military, right? You're going to get little side outlets here and there and people that will, but as a whole, the American media, the mainstream media is not going to support the United States military. They're only going to use whatever information they have to embarrass the military and embarrass the sailors in it. He's exactly right there. Listen, we did a segment on my radio show yesterday, and I didn't think we had time to do it today, but what the heck, we got a minute. How much time I got? All right, do this real quick. So there's a doctor in Brazil who's big on using HCQ as part of the cure for, or treatment for COVID, right? And the media, or one of the media outlets there, I read this whole article, Google Translate from Portuguese. And the guy's like, well, why isn't this more popular? Why aren't more people talking about it? And the doctor said, because Trump said it's good. He went through this whole long thing about how the media doesn't want to do anything that may in any way benefit Trump or make Trump look good or wise or anything in any way whatsoever. He said if this was called some other drug, then it would be, everyone would support it. But because it's called Trump's cocktail or whatever, then no media outlet is going to support it. And in fact, is going to write ridiculous articles like, well, you know, if you take 2 grams of it, you could die. And it's like, yeah, no doctor's giving 2 grams of this stuff. And I see an article, I saw one in Vanity Fair, and it was like, well, you know, Trump, who's not a doctor, okay, thanks guys, but Trump is not a doctor, said that you should take this, and one person did and died. And they don't in any way talk about how that guy ate fish tank cleaner, all right? So they're discouraging people. The media actively is discouraging people from even questioning or learning more about HCQ because it's Trump's thing. And that's what this doctor's like, that's why not as many people are talking about it, because they don't want Trump to have a win, okay? That's the same media that's talking about the Navy right here, only doing it to make the Navy look bad and look weak. Listen, you've seen how much the Navy has how much the military, try again. You've seen how much the media has been so in the tank with China, for China, repeating all Chinese propaganda. If I see one more stinking outlet talking about how China's done such a great job in lowering the curve of cases, like, you believe in the Chi-Com still? What's wrong with you? I saw an article just this morning about how China has no new cases of COVID. Are you kidding me? You're still going to believe the communists? The White House press corps or whatever, they kicked out One American News, but they let in some, I was going to say some chick. Can I say some chick? Sorry, I'll channel Jesse Kelly. They let in some chick from Phoenix TV or something, not Phoenix the city, but it's some outlet in Hong Kong. And this reporter asked some hack question. It wasn't even a question. It was Chinese propaganda. It was, China has done such a great job donating so many masks and ventilators to the American people. And Trump said, is that a question? And he goes, where are you from? And she goes, oh, I'm from Hong Kong, or Phoenix TV in Hong Kong. He goes, you owned by the communists? Are you from China? Are you owned by the Chinese? She's like, no. And she is, of course. Anyway, point is, that's our media. Okay? That's our media. Anything to make Trump look bad. Anything to parrot Chinese propaganda, even in the midst of all this thing. And anything, just like the Secretary of the Navy said, to make the Navy look bad. I totally agree with that point. If you want to jump the chain of command because you think we're blowing it on something and we're doing the wrong thing, that's fine. You're going to get fired in the end, but that's fine. Do what you got to do. And I say that's fine too. If you want to die on that sword, then it's worth it. And that's great. You should go on and live the rest of your life and be very proud that you did what you think was right, even at the sacrifice of your career. That's great. But his point is, if you're going to do that, do it, but do not go to the Navy do not go to the media because they are not on your side. Ever, ever, ever. I think about it like this. I really got to go. But our media, it's like porn. It's like porn. Don't watch it. Don't watch it ever. Don't lie to yourself. Don't think that it's neutral or you can watch it in small doses and it's healthy because you need to just cut it out of your life. Gone. It's completely gone. It's totally worthless and it's bad. It's bad for you to watch. Be a curator of information. Be a curator of where you get the truth. You're not getting it from CNN or MSNBC or any of them. Totally cut them out of your life. You'll feel so much better once you do. All right, end rant and end show. True story. Mike Slater, we'll see you back tomorrow. Spread the word.